Picture this: a teenager, barely 18 years old, hunched over a desk in a cramped apartment in Brussels, carefully dripping acid onto an official Nazi document. One wrong move, one extra drop, and the paper disintegrates. But if he gets it right, if his hand stays steady and his chemistry holds true, the Jewish name on that document vanishes without a trace, replaced by something safe, something Aryan, something that might just save a life. This wasn't a spy thriller or a Hollywood fantasy. This was the daily reality of Adolfo Kaminsky, a boy who should have been worrying about college applications and first dates, but instead became one of the most prolific document forgers of World War II, a ghost who rewrote identities with nothing but chemical solutions and nerves of steel. By the time he turned 19, Kaminsky had personally forged documents that saved an estimated 14,000 lives, most of them children, most of them marked for death in the gas chambers of Auschwitz and Treblinka. The Nazis had turned paperwork into a weapon of mass murder, and this French-Algerian Jewish kid turned it right back on them, one falsified birth certificate at a time. The year is 1940, and Europe is burning. France has fallen in a humiliating 6-week campaign, and the swastika now flies over the Eiffel Tower. For the Kaminsky family, recent immigrants from Argentina with roots in Russia, the occupation brings immediate terror. Adolfo's father runs a small dry cleaning business in Paris, and the family lives modestly, trying to blend into the fabric of French society. But blending in becomes impossible when the Nazis begin implementing their racial laws with Germanic efficiency. Every Jew over the age of 6 must wear a yellow star. Every Jewish-owned business must display a sign in the window. Every identity card, every ration book, every scrap of official paper now carries a single damning word stamped in red ink. Juif for men, Juiv for women. The paper trail doesn't just track you anymore, it condemns you. The Vichy government, eager to prove their loyalty to their new masters, begins compiling lists with obsessive detail. Name, address, profession, family members. The bureaucracy of genocide is meticulous, and it runs on documents. Young Adolfo discovers his gift almost by accident. Working in his father's dry cleaning shop, he becomes intimately familiar with chemicals, solvents, bleaches, acids, dyes. He learns which substances remove stains without damaging fabric, which combinations create specific colors, how temperature and concentration affect reactions. It's practical chemistry, learned not from textbooks but from trial and error, from ruined shirts and satisfied customers. When the family receives their stamped identity cards, Adolfo stares at that red juif and sees not an indelible mark but a chemical problem. Ink is just a pigment suspended in a medium. Paper is just cellulose fibers. Everything can be broken down, dissolved, reconstituted. He begins experimenting in secret, testing solutions on scraps of official paper stolen from trash bins, learning which acids erase ink without leaving obvious damage, which pens produce the most authentic-looking replacements. His father thinks he's wasting time. His mother worries he'll get them all killed, but Adolfo can't stop. Every time he walks past a Jew wearing that yellow star, every time he hears about another family deported to the East, he feels the weight of knowledge, the terrible responsibility of a skill that could matter. The turning point comes in 1943 when the deportations accelerate. The Nazis and their French collaborators begin systematically emptying Paris of its Jewish population, neighborhood by neighborhood, block by block. The Velodrome d'Hiver roundup in July of 42 had already sent over 13,000 Jews, including more than 4,000 children, to the transit camp at Drancy, and from there to Auschwitz. Now the pace quickens. Adolfo's own family barely escapes a raid, fleeing their apartment minutes before the French police arrive. They go underground, moving from safe house to safe house, part of the growing network of hidden Jews trying to outlast the occupation. But hiding isn't enough for Adolfo. In the resistance network, word spreads about this kid who can make documents, who can turn a Jew into a Gentile with nothing but chemicals and steady hands. They bring him to a small apartment in the 6th arrondissement that serves as an underground workshop. The space is cramped, poorly ventilated, lit by a single bare bulb. The tools are primitive: stolen Nazi stamps, blank identity cards obtained through bribery or theft, inks mixed from whatever pigments they can scrounge. This is where Adolfo Kaminsky truly goes to work. The demand is overwhelming and immediate. Every day, dozens of people need new papers, families need matching documents. Children separated from parents need birth certificates that give them new names, new birthdays, new histories. Refugees need transit papers. Resistance fighters need multiple identities. Kaminsky works 18-hour days, 20-hour days, sometimes going 72 hours without sleep, because sleep feels like betrayal when you know that every hour you rest is an hour someone might be caught. He develops techniques that become legendary in the underground, using lactic acid to remove ink, without damaging paper fibers, matching government printing styles so perfectly that even Nazi officials can't spot the fakes, aging new documents with tea and cigarette smoke, so they look properly weathered. His workspace becomes a laboratory of identity, where Jewish children become Catholic orphans, where entire family trees are rewritten, where the paper trail that condemns is transformed into the paper trail that saves. The Nazis believe their system is foolproof, that their stamps and signatures and serial numbers create an unbreakable chain of verification. Kaminsky proves them catastrophically wrong. The mathematics of his work haunt him in the quiet moments. For every hour he sleeps, he calculates, perhaps 30 documents go unmade. For every 30 documents, perhaps 6 lives remain at risk. The weight of that arithmetic crushes sleep into something criminal, rest into something unforgivable. His hands develop tremors from exhaustion and chemical exposure. His eyes burn from the poor lighting and intense focus. He loses weight, develops a chronic cough from the fumes, ages years in months. But he doesn't stop. In the underground network, they start calling him the Wizard and later simply the Ghost. He becomes so proficient that he can forge a complete identity set, birth certificate through work papers, in under 2 hours. His forgeries become the gold standard, the documents other forgers try to copy. Nazi checkpoints wave through papers bearing his invisible signature. Gestapo officers, trained to spot fakes, examine his work and find nothing wrong. In a war fought with tanks and bombers, this 18-year-old boy wields chemistry like a weapon, and his battlefield is measured in millimeters of paper and drops of acid. The Nazis would later call the French resistance a nuisance. They had no idea that one of their most dangerous enemies was a teenager who never fired a shot. The chemistry of forgery is far more complex than most people imagine, and Kaminsky becomes a master of molecular deception. The Nazis use specialized inks formulated to resist tampering, containing metallic compounds that bond deeply with paper fibers. Standard bleach or rubbing alcohol leaves telltale stains, yellow halos that scream forgery to any trained eye. Kaminsky's breakthrough comes from understanding that different inks require different solvents. He experiments with lactic acid, potassium permanganate, hydrogen peroxide in varying concentrations, even compounds extracted from his father's dry-cleaning chemicals. Each official stamp and signature requires its own custom solution. The red Joave stamp, for instance, uses an iron gall ink that Kaminsky learns to lift using a careful application of oxalic acid, applied with a brush so fine it contains only 3 hairs. The process takes 15 minutes per document, working under magnification, breathing shallowly to avoid disturbing the chemical reaction. One miscalculation and the paper browns, curls, or develops a texture that feels wrong to searching fingers. The Gestapo trains its officers to feel documents as much as see them, running thumbs across surfaces to detect the ghost of erased text. Kaminsky must erase not just visually, but texturally, leaving paper that feels untouched. But erasing is only half the battle. Creating the replacement identity requires forging an entire bureaucratic history that can withstand Nazi verification. Every French identity card contains multiple security features, embossed seals, watermarks, serial numbers that follow complex patterns, signatures from specific officials who change by region and date. Kaminsky must memorize the signatures of dozens of mayors, police chiefs, and civil registrars. He practices each signature hundreds of times until his hand can reproduce it without conscious thought. He catalogues the serial number systems, learning that cards issued in Lyon between May and August of 42 follow a different numbering scheme than those from Marseille in the same period. He ages inks by exposing them to sunlight filtered through specific colored glass, matching the exact fade that occurs in documents carried in pockets for months. He even replicates the random imperfections, the slight smudges and fingerprints that make documents look authentically handled rather than freshly forged. The goal isn't just to fool a casual glance at a checkpoint. These documents must survive detailed inspection at Gestapo headquarters, must hold up when cross-referenced against municipal records, must pass the scrutiny of officials who have processed thousands of legitimate papers. The scale of the operation expands rapidly through 43 and into 44. What begins as Kaminsky working alone in a single room grows into a small network. The resistance recruits other forgers, though none match his skill, and they establish multiple workshops across Paris and later in the free zone of southern France. Kaminsky becomes a teacher, training others in his techniques, but he keeps the most delicate work for himself. The workshop operates with paranoid security. Documents arrive through couriers who don't know the workshop's location. Clients never meet the forgers. Each identity is assigned a number, never a name, because names can be tortured out of captured resistance members. The workspace itself is designed for rapid destruction. Bottles of chemicals are positioned so a single kick sends them cascading onto the work tables, destroying evidence. Stamps and seals are cast in low melting point alloys that can be melted into unrecognizable lumps in minutes. The forgers practice evacuation drills, timing how quickly they can pack essential tools and disappear. Twice, the Gestapo comes within blocks of the workshop. Both times, Kaminsky and his team vanish minutes before the raids, carrying only what fits in coat pockets, abandoning months of prepared materials. The human cost of this work becomes inescapable. Every document carries a story. A mother arrives begging for papers that will let her 8-year-old daughter pass as a Catholic orphan to be hidden in a convent in Brittany. A father needs documentation showing his sons died of typhus last year, so the boys can be smuggled to Switzerland under different names. Elderly couples require papers aging them down by 20 years because the Nazis are deporting anyone over 65 immediately without even the pretense of work camps. Kaminsky never asks for payment. The resistance provides him with enough money for materials and basic survival, nothing more. He lives on black market bread and weak coffee, spending nothing on himself because every franc saved is another blank identity card purchased through the underground. The faces blur together after a while, hundreds of desperate people whose only hope is a piece of paper transformed by acid and ink. Some return weeks later to thank him, to report they made it through a checkpoint or across a border. Most he never sees again, never knows if they survived or if his forgery failed at some crucial moment. By the spring of 1944, with the Allied invasion looming and the Nazi grip on France beginning to crack, Kaminsky has perfected his craft to an almost supernatural level. He can spot a Gestapo forgery detector, a new type of official trained specifically to catch false documents, at 20 paces just by how the man holds papers up to the light. He has memorized the feel of authentic paper stock from 17 different government printing offices. His fingers can detect a thickness variation of 0.02 millimeters. He works now almost entirely by touch and instinct, his eyes so damaged from chemical exposure and poor lighting that he wears thick glasses he can barely afford. The tremor in his hands has become permanent, yet somehow, when he picks up the brush to apply acid or the pen to forge a signature, the shaking stops. His body understands that steadiness here means survival for someone somewhere. The liberation of Paris is still months away, and the Nazis, sensing their grip weakening, accelerate deportations in a final frenzy of destruction. Kaminsky's work becomes more urgent, more dangerous, more absolutely necessary with each passing day. The summer of 1944 brings both hope and terror in equal measure. Allied forces land in Normandy on June 6th, and suddenly the impossible seems within reach. France might actually be liberated. But the Nazi response to their crumbling empire is predictably savage. Rather than retreating in orderly fashion, they intensify their campaign of extermination, desperate to complete their genocidal mission before the military collapse. In Paris, the deportation trains to Auschwitz run more frequently than ever. The last major convoy leaves Drancy on July 31st, 44, carrying over 1,000 Jews eastward to their deaths. The Gestapo becomes more paranoid, more thorough in document checks, more willing to shoot first and verify later. For Kaminsky and his network, the danger multiplies exponentially. The Nazis know they're losing France, and they want to take as many Jews with them as possible. Every checkpoint becomes a potential death sentence. Every forged document must be absolutely flawless because there are no second chances anymore. Kaminsky's reputation within the resistance has grown to legendary status, and with that legend comes impossible demands. He's asked to forge not just identity cards now, but work permits for forced labor camps, allowing resistance fighters to infiltrate and gather intelligence. He creates discharge papers for Jewish soldiers, supposedly released from the French army before the Nazi occupation, giving them cover stories that explain their presence in Paris. He even forges German military documents, transit papers that allow resistance couriers to move through checkpoints carrying messages and supplies. Each new type of document requires weeks of study, obtaining samples through bribery or theft, analyzing paper composition and printing techniques, recreating official seals with hand-carved stamps. The German documents are particularly dangerous because they come with serial numbers logged in Nazi headquarters. If someone checks the number against central records, the forgery is exposed instantly. And not just the person carrying the document, but everyone in the chain leading back to the forger faces execution. Kaminsky knows this. He forges them anyway. The alternative is letting the resistance operate blind, letting fighters get caught because they lack the papers to move freely. Sleep becomes a theoretical concept rather than a physical reality. Kaminsky develops a technique of micro-naps, closing his eyes for 10-minute intervals when his hands shake too badly to work, then jolting awake to continue. He drinks coffee cut with chicory because real coffee is impossible to find, and the bitter liquid keeps him functional if not truly alert. His workspace is a haze of chemical fumes that burn his lungs and leave him coughing blood into rags he hides from the others. The other forgers in the network beg him to rest, to let them handle more of the workload, but Kaminsky has done the math again and again. He's faster than anyone else, more accurate than anyone else. For every hour he rests, 6 more documents go unmade. For every 6 documents, 2 lives remain at risk. The arithmetic is inescapable and unforgiving. His hands develop chemical burns that never fully heal, leaving his fingertips scarred and hypersensitive. The constant exposure to acids and solvents causes nosebleeds that he cauterizes with silver nitrate, working through the pain because stopping means someone dies. The closest call comes in early August. The Gestapo, acting on information from an informant, raids an apartment building 3 floors below Kaminsky's current workshop. They're not looking for forgers specifically, but for a resistance cell planning sabotage operations. The Nazis go door to door, checking papers, searching rooms, arresting anyone whose story doesn't hold perfectly. Kaminsky and 2 other forgers hear the boots on the stairs, the shouted German commands, the sounds of furniture being overturned. They have perhaps 90 seconds before the Gestapo reaches their floor. The evacuation plan kicks in with practiced precision. Kaminsky sweeps the most incriminating materials, the Nazi stamps and blank identity cards, into a satchel. His colleague knocks over the chemical bottles, sending acid pooling across the work table and dissolving days of prepared documents. The third forger melts the signature seals in a small alcohol burner, reducing them to shapeless metal puddles. They exit through a back window onto a roof, crawling across tiles still slick from morning rain, dropping into an alley 2 buildings away. Behind them, they hear the Gestapo breaking down their workshop door. The chemicals have done their work, leaving nothing but ruined paper pulp and the smell of burning. The Nazis find an empty room that might have been used for anything. Kaminsky loses 3 weeks of prepared materials, dozens of blank documents, and his most reliable set of tools. But he's alive, free, and still capable of forging. Within 48 hours, he's set up in a new location and back at work. Paris is liberated on August 25, 1944, and the city erupts in celebration. People dance in the streets, tear down Nazi flags, drag collaborators from their homes. For most Parisians, the nightmare is over. For Kaminsky, it's just beginning to expand. The liberation of France doesn't mean the end of Nazi genocide, just its geographical shift. Jews are still being murdered by the thousands in Eastern Europe, in Hungary, in the camps the Allies haven't yet reached. Refugees pour into liberated France with nothing but the clothes on their backs, needing documents to prove their identities, to reclaim property, to search for lost family members. Kaminsky's skills remain desperately necessary, but now the work shifts. Instead of creating false identities to hide Jews, he begins forging documents to restore real ones, recreating birth certificates and marriage licenses destroyed in the chaos of war. The chemical formulas remain the same, but the purpose transforms from concealment to revelation, from erasing names to restoring them. His war is far from over. In fact, for Adolfo Kaminsky, the war will never truly end. The months following liberation reveal the true scope of the Holocaust, and with each revelation, Kaminsky's mission becomes more urgent. Survivors trickle back from the camps, skeletal figures with numbers tattooed on their forearms, and stories too horrific to fully believe. They arrive without documents, without proof of who they were before the Nazis tried to erase them from existence. The French government, now purged of collaborators, attempts to process these returning survivors, but bureaucracy moves slowly and many lack any official record of their previous lives. Birth certificates were destroyed when synagogues burned. Marriage licenses vanished when city halls were bombed. Entire family trees exist only in the memories of the sole survivors, and those memories are fragmented by trauma. Kaminsky begins forging documents of restoration, creating official papers that match survivor testimonies, giving legal existence back to people the Nazis tried to reduce to ash and smoke. This work carries different risks than wartime forgery. Now he's dealing with legitimate authorities who will eventually verify these documents against reconstructed records. The forgeries must be perfect, not just visually but factually, matching dates and places that can be cross-referenced once archives are rebuilt. But Europe's Jewish refugees need more than restored identities. Thousands want to leave the continent entirely, to escape the graveyard of European Jewry, and start over in Palestine, in America, in anywhere that doesn't reek of death camps and mass graves. The British, who control Palestine, have imposed strict immigration quotas, allowing only a trickle of Jewish refugees into the Mandate territory. Ships carrying Holocaust survivors are turned away, sent back to displaced persons camps in Europe, where survivors live in conditions barely better than the concentration camps they just escaped. The Zionist underground movement, determined to bring Jews to Palestine regardless of British restrictions, contacts Kaminsky. They need documents for illegal immigration, papers that will get refugees onto ships and through checkpoints, identity cards that transform Polish Holocaust survivors into Greek fishermen or Turkish merchants, professions that explain their travel routes and justify their presence in Mediterranean ports. Kaminsky, exhausted from 4 years of continuous work, agrees without hesitation. The war against genocide continues, just with different borders and different enemies. The scope of this new operation dwarfs anything Kaminsky attempted during the Nazi occupation. Instead of dozens of documents per week, the Zionist network needs hundreds, eventually thousands. Entire shiploads of refugees require matching paperwork, coordinated stories, identity sets that interlock and support each other under interrogation. Kaminsky establishes a larger workshop, trains more forgers in his techniques, systematizes the process of mass document production, but he maintains control over the most sensitive work, the creation of master templates and official seals that others will copy. The operation becomes a factory of false identities, running 24 hours a day, staffed by shifts of forgers who rotate through to prevent exhaustion. Kaminsky himself rarely leaves the workshop. He sleeps on a cot in the corner, wakes to check the night shift's work, corrects errors, pushes the pace faster. The British authorities aren't Nazis, but they're thorough, and a single poorly forged document can expose an entire network, strand hundreds of refugees in legal limbo. The human element remains inescapable despite the industrial scale. A teenage girl arrives, orphaned at Auschwitz, wanting papers that show she's 21 so she can emigrate without a guardian. An elderly man needs documents proving he has family in Palestine. though his entire family was murdered, and the relatives he claims are fictitious names Kaminsky invents on the spot. A couple wants matching papers showing a wedding that never happened, creating a legal marriage to replace the religious ceremony performed in secret in the Warsaw Ghetto before the uprising. Each case requires not just technical skill, but imagination, the ability to construct plausible life histories that will survive bureaucratic scrutiny. Kaminsky becomes the author of alternate realities, writing backstories for people whose real stories ended in crematoriums. He ages himself another decade in the process, his hair thinning, his vision deteriorating further, his hands permanently stained with chemical residue that no amount of washing removes. He's 20 years old now and he looks 40. The British eventually catch on to the forgery operation, though they never identify Kaminsky personally. They begin implementing new security features in travel documents, changing seal designs monthly, using paper stock with embedded fibers that glow under ultraviolet light. Each new security measure forces Kaminsky to adapt, to acquire new equipment, to develop new chemical processes. He obtains an ultraviolet lamp through the black market and reverse engineers the fiber composition in British paper, eventually locating a textile mill that produces similar material. He bribes a printer to create new seal designs before they're officially announced, staying one step ahead of the security changes. The forger's arms race escalates through 1945 and into 46. Ships carrying refugees with Kaminsky's documents slip past British patrols. Some are caught, passengers detained, but the documents are so convincing that many refugees are released after questioning, the British unable to prove the papers are false. For every ship intercepted, 2 more make it through. Kaminsky's invisible hand guides thousands to safety, one forged passport at a time. By 1947, Kaminsky's forgery network has evolved into something unprecedented in scale and sophistication. The operation now spans multiple countries, with satellite workshops in Marseille, Geneva, and Brussels, all coordinating through coded messages and courier networks. The British blockade of Palestine intensifies as tensions escalate toward the inevitable war between Jewish and Arab populations, but the underground immigration continues unabated. Kaminsky personally forges documents for Operation Magic Carpet, the secret airlift of Yemeni Jews, creating papers that transform ancient Jewish communities into modern refugees with plausible travel histories. He produces identity sets for Operation Ezra and Nehemiah, the evacuation of Iraqi Jews facing persecution after Israel's founding. His work expands beyond Jewish refugees to include anti-colonial fighters in Algeria, resistance members fleeing Franco's Spain, dissidents escaping Stalin's Eastern Europe. The teenager who started by erasing single names from Nazi documents now runs an international forgery operation that undermines multiple governments simultaneously. The chemistry remains the same, but the geopolitics grow exponentially more complex. The psychological toll of sustained forgery work manifests in ways Kaminsky never anticipated during the war. During the Nazi occupation, the moral clarity was absolute. Forged documents or people die in gas chambers. Now the decisions carry ambiguity. A man requests papers to enter Palestine, claiming he's fleeing persecution, but intelligence suggests he might be a Soviet agent planning to infiltrate Zionist organizations. Does Kaminsky forge the documents or refuse? A woman wants identity cards for children she claims are orphans, but something in her story doesn't align, and Kaminsky suspects human trafficking. The wartime binary of good versus evil dissolves into shades of gray that exhaust him more than the physical labor ever did. He begins making mistakes, small errors that his pre-war self would never have allowed. A transposed digit in a serial number, a signature that doesn't quite match the exemplar. His colleagues notice, suggest he take a break, rest for a month or 2. Kaminsky refuses because rest still feels like betrayal, even though the immediate threat of Nazi genocide has passed. The mathematics of survival continue running in his head, calculating lives saved per hour worked, unable to stop the equation even when he wants to. The founding of Israel in May 1948 briefly gives Kaminsky hope that his work might finally end. With a Jewish state established, refugees have a legal destination, immigration quotas become irrelevant, The need for forged documents should theoretically disappear. But the Arab-Israeli war erupts immediately, and suddenly Kaminsky faces requests from a new direction. Israeli intelligence needs documents for undercover operatives in Arab countries, forgeries that transform Israeli agents into Egyptian businessmen or Lebanese merchants. The Holocaust forger becomes a Cold War operative, his skills repurposed for espionage rather than rescue. Kaminsky struggles with this transition. Forging documents to save refugees feels unambiguously righteous. Forging documents for spies, even Israeli spies working to protect the Jewish state, carries moral weight he's not certain he can bear. He begins to question whether his gift is a blessing or a curse, whether the ability to rewrite identity on paper has trapped him in a cycle he can never escape. The breaking point arrives in 1950, when Kaminsky is asked to forge documents for an assassination operation. Israeli intelligence plans to eliminate a former Nazi officer living under a false identity in Syria, and they need Kaminsky to create the papers that will get their operative into position. The target is unquestionably guilty of war crimes, personally responsible for hundreds of Jewish deaths. Justice demands his execution, but Kaminsky realizes that if he agrees, he crosses a line from saving lives to enabling killing. The chemistry is identical, the techniques unchanged, but the purpose transforms his gift into something darker. He spends 3 days unable to work, unable to sleep, unable to reconcile the teenager who forged documents to rescue children with the man being asked to forge documents for revenge. In the end, he refuses. The Israeli operation proceeds with documents forged by someone else, someone less skilled, and the mission fails when guards detect the fake papers at a checkpoint. Kaminsky never learns if his refusal saved the Nazi's life or simply delayed inevitable justice. This refusal marks the beginning of Kaminsky's gradual withdrawal from forgery work. Through the early 1950s, he takes fewer commissions, trains others to replace him, slowly extracts himself from the networks that have defined his entire adult life. He's 26 years old and has been forging documents for nearly a decade without substantial break. His hands shake constantly now, the tremor no longer stopping even when he picks up the brush. His lungs are scarred from chemical exposure, leaving him winded after climbing a single flight of stairs. His eyes require thick corrective lenses, and even with glasses, he sees halos around lights, a permanent consequence of years working in dim conditions with caustic substances. Doctors tell him bluntly that continued exposure to forging chemicals will kill him before he reaches 40. Kaminsky nods, understanding intellectually that he must stop, but emotionally unable to fully abandon the work that has given his life meaning. He continues taking occasional commissions, unable to say no when someone desperate appears at his door, but the pace slows from dozens of documents per week to perhaps 1 or 2 per month. The 1950s forced Kaminsky to confront an identity crisis he never had time to process during the war years. He spent his adolescence and early 20s as a forger, his entire adult identity built around the ability to erase and rewrite other people's identities. But who is Adolfo Kaminsky when he's not hunched over a desk with acid and ink? He never finished school, never learned a conventional trade beyond his father's dry cleaning business, never developed interests or hobbies outside the consuming demands of document forgery. His social circle consists entirely of other resistance members and refugees, people bound to him by shared trauma rather than genuine friendship. He attempts normalcy, taking a job as a photographer, a profession that uses some of his technical skills with chemistry and optics without the legal risks of forgery. The work is honest, legal, even occasionally satisfying. He photographs weddings and family portraits, capturing moments of joy that stand in stark contrast to the desperate faces he remembers from the forgery workshop. But the transition feels incomplete, as though he's play-acting at normal life while his real self remains suspended in wartime urgency. The psychological aftermath of his wartime experiences manifests in unexpected ways. Kaminsky develops an obsessive need to document everything, photographing scenes obsessively, keeping meticulous journals, saving every scrap of paper that crosses his desk. Therapists would later recognize this as a response to years spent erasing documentation, a compulsive need to preserve rather than destroy. He suffers from nightmares, not of Nazi violence, but of failed forgeries, dreams where his chemical solutions don't work, where ink won't lift from paper, where documents disintegrate in his hands while people scream for help he cannot provide. He wakes gasping, his sheets soaked with sweat, his hands moving through the motions of forging even in sleep. During the day, he finds himself automatically analyzing documents, noticing security features in ordinary paperwork, mentally cataloging how he would forge each item. The skill has become so deeply embedded that he cannot turn it off. A simple trip to renew his own identity card becomes an exercise in professional assessment, noting that the clerk's signature is easily replicable, that the seal uses outdated ink, that the entire document could be forged in under 90 minutes. The political upheavals of the late 50s and 60s pull Kaminsky back into active forgery despite his attempts at retirement. The Algerian War of Independence erupts, and suddenly Kaminsky faces urgent requests from the FLN, the Algerian National Liberation Front, fighting against French colonial rule. His father's family originally came from Algeria before migrating to Russia, giving Kaminsky a personal connection to the conflict. The French government uses identity papers as weapons of control, requiring Algerians to carry special documentation, imposing curfews and movement restrictions, creating a system of bureaucratic oppression that echoes Nazi policies. Kaminsky cannot ignore the parallels. He begins forging documents for Algerian independence fighters, creating French identity cards that allow them to move freely in Paris, travel papers that let them cross borders to coordinate with international supporters. The work is dangerous in new ways because he's now forging documents of the French government, his own country, risking prosecution for treason rather than just document fraud. The Algerian work reconnects Kaminsky with the moral clarity he lost after Israel's founding. These forgeries save lives without the ethical ambiguity of intelligence operations. FLN members carrying his documents escape French police raids, avoid detention camps, survive to continue their independence struggle. Kaminsky establishes strict rules for this phase of his work. He will forge documents for defensive purposes only, papers that help people escape or hide, never documents that facilitate attacks or assassinations. He will not enable violence, only resistance. This distinction matters deeply to him, even if it's invisible to the French authorities who would prosecute him regardless. He works alone now, trusting no one else with the techniques he perfected during World War II, maintaining operational security that borders on paranoia. His apartment becomes a fortress of locked drawers and hidden compartments, every surface wiped clean of fingerprints, every tool capable of being destroyed in seconds if police come knocking. The photography business serves as cover, explaining the chemicals and paper stocks and darkroom equipment that could otherwise raise suspicion. By 1962, when Algeria finally achieves independence, Kaminsky has forged documents for 3 separate wars of liberation, saved an estimated 14,000 lives during the Holocaust, and enabled thousands more to escape oppression in the post-war years. He's 37 years old, physically broken, emotionally exhausted, and finally ready to truly retire from forgery. His hands shake so badly now that the work takes 3 times longer than it did in his youth. His vision has deteriorated to the point where even simple forgeries require magnification equipment. His lungs rattle with every breath, the accumulated damage from decades of chemical exposure finally catching up. Doctors tell him what he already knows. Continue this work and he'll be dead within 5 years. Kaminsky agrees to stop, makes promises to himself and to the few people who still care about his survival. But in the back of his mind, the arithmetic continues running. For every hour he rests, how many documents go unmade? For every document unmade, whose life remains at risk? The mathematics of sacrifice, calculated in his teenage years during the Nazi occupation, have become the permanent architecture of his conscience. The true retirement Kaminsky seeks remains elusive throughout the 1960s and 70s, because oppression never takes a vacation and his reputation in underground networks is impossible to erase. Requests continue arriving through circuitous routes, encoded letters and midnight visitors, people who know someone who once met the legendary forger from the war. He forges documents for draft resistors during the Vietnam War, creating identity cards that help young Americans disappear into Europe rather than fight in Southeast Asia. He creates papers for dissidents fleeing military dictatorships in Latin America, transforming Chilean socialists and Argentine leftists into European tourists with clean backgrounds. He helps Spanish anti-fascists still fighting Franco's regime decades after the Civil War ended, Portuguese activists resisting Salazar's dictatorship, Greek opponents of the military junta. Each time he tells himself this is the last commission, the final favor, but each time another desperate face appears and he cannot say no. The chemistry of forgery has become an addiction he cannot break, not to the chemicals themselves, but to the knowledge that his hands alone possess the skill to save lives through molecular manipulation. His family life suffers catastrophically under the weight of his obsessive commitment to forgery. Kaminsky marries in 1953, desperate for normalcy, hoping that domestic responsibility will anchor him to ordinary life. He fathers 3 children over the next decade, daughters who grow up barely knowing their father. He's present physically but absent emotionally, his mind always half in the workshop, calculating improvements to techniques, worrying about the last batch of documents he produced. His wife begs him to stop, to choose his living children over the abstract strangers he helps through forgery. She cannot understand why a man who suffered so much during the war voluntarily continues suffering, why he won't simply take the family to America or Israel and start over with a clean slate. The arguments escalate through the late 50s, vicious fights about priorities and responsibilities, about whether one man's skills obligate him to sacrifice his health and family for strangers. Kaminsky has no answer that satisfies her, because he cannot explain the arithmetic that runs constantly in his head. The marriage deteriorates into cold coexistence, 2 people sharing an apartment but living separate lives. The breaking point in his marriage coincides with a close call that nearly destroys everything. In 1968, French police investigating a forgery ring connected to leftist radicals raid an apartment building where Kaminsky occasionally works. He's not present during the raid, but the workshop contains materials traceable to him through technique and chemical composition. Police forensics have advanced considerably since World War II. They can now match paper types, analyze ink formulations, identify individual forgers by microscopic details in their work. Kaminsky learns about the raid through his network and has perhaps 12 hours before police connect the evidence to his photography studio. He spends a frantic night destroying 2 decades of accumulated tools and materials, burning master stamps in his darkroom sink, pouring chemicals down drains, shredding template documents. His wife watches in horror as he systematically erases evidence of his double life, finally understanding the magnitude of the risks he's been taking. She gives him an ultimatum: choose forgery or choose your family. Kaminsky chooses his family, or at least he chooses to try choosing them. The police investigation eventually goes cold, unable to identify the master forger, but the damage to his marriage is irreparable. Through the 70s, Kaminsky makes genuine attempts at ordinary life, focusing on photography, spending time with his daughters, trying to be present rather than perpetually distracted by underground networks. He becomes a commercial photographer with modest success, shooting for magazines and advertising agencies, work that uses his technical skills without moral complexity. His daughters remember this period as the only time their father seemed fully human, laughing at dinner table jokes, attending school performances, taking family vacations to the countryside. But even during these years, he occasionally takes forgery commissions, unable to completely abandon the work. He forges documents for Vietnamese boat people fleeing communist rule, for Cambodian refugees escaping the Khmer Rouge genocide, for Soviet Jews applying to emigrate to Israel. The commissions are infrequent enough that his family can pretend they're not happening, can maintain the fiction of normalcy between the occasional midnight visitor and the chemical smell that sometimes drifts from his darkroom. Kaminsky perfects the art of compartmentalization, keeping his 2 lives separate through careful scheduling and elaborate lies. The decade ends with Kaminsky approaching 60, his children grown and independent, his marriage a fragile shell maintained more from habit than affection. He's alive, which is more than most people predicted when they saw his chemical-scarred hands and heard his labored breathing. He's forged documents in 4 wars and countless smaller conflicts, saved perhaps 30,000 lives across 4 decades, if you count both direct Holocaust rescue and all subsequent operations. The number is an estimate because Kaminsky never kept comprehensive records, too paranoid about evidence that could be seized and used against the people he helped. But 30,000 is the figure that circulates in the underground networks, a legend more than a fact. The ghost of Paris, who could rewrite reality with acid and ink. Kaminsky himself has no idea if the number is accurate. He stopped counting in 1946, when the work blurred into an endless stream of desperate faces and blank documents. The only number that still matters to him is the one he can never know. How many people died because he slept, because he rested, because he chose his own survival over 1 more hour at the workshop. That arithmetic haunts him more than any nightmare. The 1980s bring an unexpected shift in Kaminsky's relationship with his past. For nearly 4 decades, he's maintained absolute secrecy about his wartime forgery work, operating under the assumption that anonymity equals safety for himself and everyone he helped. But Holocaust denial begins gaining traction in certain political circles, pseudo-historians publishing books claiming the genocide was exaggerated or fabricated, far-right groups spreading propaganda that minimizes Nazi atrocities. Kaminsky, now in his 60s, watches this revisionism with growing horror. The people he saved are dying of old age, their testimonies disappearing with them. The documents he forged are so perfect that many exist in archives as legitimate records, the forgery invisible even to historians. He realizes that his silence, maintained for operational security, now serves the deniers by erasing evidence of both Nazi persecution and Jewish resistance. After decades of anonymizing his work, of being the invisible ghost, Kaminsky makes the radical decision to speak publicly about his wartime activities, to become a witness to history rather than its silent facilitator. The first interviews are hesitant, partial revelations to small Jewish community organizations and Holocaust education groups. Kaminsky describes his techniques in general terms, careful not to reveal details that could enable modern forgery, but specific enough to prove his expertise. He shows his chemical-scarred hands, the permanent tremor, the medical records documenting decades of toxic exposure. He provides photographs from his wartime years, grainy images of a teenage boy who looks simultaneously ancient and impossibly young. Historians initially greet his claims with skepticism because his story sounds too extraordinary, too much like the plot of a thriller novel. A teenage autodidact teaching himself advanced chemistry, forging documents so perfect they fooled the Gestapo, saving 14,000 lives before his 20th birthday. The scale seems implausible until Kaminsky begins producing corroboration. Survivors emerge with the documents he forged, papers that have sat in drawers for 40 years. Birth certificates and identity cards that allowed them to survive. Resistance members confirm his role, providing details that match his account. The skepticism transforms into astonishment as historians realize they've discovered a major figure whose contributions to Holocaust rescue went completely unrecorded. The publicity brings both vindication and unexpected consequences. Kaminsky receives letters from people he saved, some of whom never knew a forger created their survival documents, children who grew up thinking the papers their parents carried were legitimate. They write to thank him, to tell him about their lives, their children and grandchildren who exist because of his teenage chemistry experiments. These letters provide the emotional closure Kaminsky never experienced during the war. Validation that the sacrificed sleep and ruined health achieved something lasting. But the publicity also attracts hostile attention. Neo-Nazi groups send death threats calling him a liar and a fraud, demanding he admit his story is fabricated. French authorities, embarrassed that a major wartime forger operated undetected for decades, briefly consider prosecuting him for his post-war forgery work, helping Algerian independence fighters. The investigation goes nowhere because the statute of limitations has expired, and prosecuting an elderly Holocaust hero for anti-fascist activities would be political suicide. But the threat reminds Kaminsky that speaking truth carries risks even 40 years after the events. Through the late 80s and early 90s, Kaminsky becomes a regular speaker at schools and universities, sharing his story with young people who have no living memory of World War II. He's a natural storyteller, despite decades of cultivated silence, able to make chemistry fascinating to bored teenagers, to convey the moral weight of his decisions without preaching. He explains the technical aspects of forgery not to encourage crime, but to demystify the process, to show that resistance doesn't require superhuman abilities, just knowledge applied with determination. His message resonates particularly with immigrant and minority students who understand instinctively that papers can mean the difference between safety and danger, that bureaucracy can be a weapon against the vulnerable. Kaminsky never encourages illegal activity, but he makes clear that unjust laws deserve resistance, that sometimes morality requires breaking rules designed to enable oppression. His lectures walk a careful line between celebrating past resistance and avoiding incitement to present law-breaking, a balance that becomes harder to maintain as his audiences grow larger and more diverse. The fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989 and the subsequent collapse of the Soviet Union create one final surge of forgery requests. Kaminsky, now 65 years old and in declining health, faces pleas from people trapped in dissolving communist states who need documents to emigrate. Jews leaving Russia and Ukraine, political dissidents fleeing Romania and Bulgaria, ethnic minorities escaping the chaos of Yugoslavia's breakup. The requests echo the immediate post-war years, the same desperation and urgency, the same bureaucratic barriers trapping people who have already suffered too much. Kaminsky's doctors forbid him from returning to active forgery, warning that chemical exposure at his age and in his physical condition amounts to suicide. He compromises by training younger activists in his techniques, passing on knowledge accumulated over 50 years, creating a new generation of forgers to handle the work his body can no longer sustain. He provides guidance remotely, reviewing sample documents, suggesting improvements to technique, but never picking up the brush himself. It's a bitter compromise, intellectually knowing he's doing the right thing by delegating, emotionally feeling like he's abandoning people who need his specific skills. The arithmetic continues haunting him, calculating lives at risk per hour of instruction given versus documents he could forge personally if he sacrificed his remaining health. The final decade of the 20th century forces Kaminsky to confront the ultimate question that has haunted him since his teenage years in Nazi-occupied Paris. Was the sacrifice worth it? His health continues deteriorating, the cumulative damage from decades of chemical exposure, manifesting in respiratory failure, liver damage, and neurological issues that leave him increasingly frail. He requires oxygen assistance to breathe, his scarred lungs unable to process air efficiently. His hands shake so violently now that he cannot hold a pen without assistance, the very tools that saved thousands now rendered useless by the price of their use. Medical specialists tell his family what everyone already knows. Kaminsky's body is failing because he chose again and again across 50 years to prioritize the survival of strangers over his own health. The doctors present this as tragedy, a waste of life through obsessive self-sacrifice. Kaminsky sees it differently. Every labored breath he takes is proof that 30,000 people breathe freely because of choices he made in dim workshops with acid-stained fingers. His children struggle to reconcile the absent father they remember with the historical hero the world celebrates. They grew up resenting his obsession with forgery, angry that strangers mattered more than his own family, bitter about cancelled birthday parties and forgotten school events because their father was too busy saving someone else's children. Now they attend ceremonies where Holocaust survivors embrace their father with tears, where historians praise his contributions to resistance history, where governments that once hunted him now award him medals for valor. The cognitive dissonance is overwhelming. Was he a hero or a terrible father? Can someone be both simultaneously? Kaminsky's eldest daughter eventually makes peace with the contradiction by recognizing that great historical acts often require personal sacrifice that destroys families. Her father was not absent by choice but by compulsion, driven by an arithmetic of survival that allowed him no other path. This understanding doesn't erase the childhood pain, but it contextualizes it, transforms resentment into a complicated mixture of pride and grief for the ordinary life her father could never allow himself. The attention Kaminsky receives in his final years attracts filmmakers and authors wanting to tell his story. Multiple documentaries chronicle his wartime activities, interviewing survivors who owe their lives to his forgeries, tracking down the scattered network of forgers he trained, reconstructing the technical details of his chemical processes. A biography published in 2009, after extensive interviews with Kaminsky in his 80s, finally provides comprehensive documentation of a life spent in shadows. The book becomes a surprise bestseller, translated into 17 languages, introducing Kaminsky's story to audiences worldwide. Schools add his biography to Holocaust education curricula. Museums create exhibits featuring his tools and sample documents. The teenager who worked in absolute anonymity, whose greatest success was remaining invisible, becomes a public figure in his final years. Kaminsky finds the attention both gratifying and deeply uncomfortable. He never sought recognition, never wanted to be celebrated as a hero. He simply did what seemed necessary given the skills he possessed and the times he lived through. What troubles Kaminsky most in these final years is the realization that the world still needs forgers, that oppression and persecution continue creating situations where people must choose between legal compliance and moral resistance. Syrian refugees drowning in the Mediterranean need documents that will get them into Europe. Rohingya Muslims fleeing genocide in Myanmar need identity papers that prove their existence. Mexican families separated by immigration enforcement need documents that keep them together. The specifics change, but the fundamental dynamic remains: bureaucracy as weapon, papers as barriers, and desperate people trapped between law and survival. Kaminsky knows his techniques could help, that the chemistry he mastered in 1943 still works in the 21st century. But he also knows he cannot help, that his body has finally imposed limits his will cannot override. The frustration of possessing knowledge that could save lives, but lacking the physical capacity to apply it, becomes the defining agony of his final years. He trains younger activists when possible, shares what he can, but he knows his techniques require years of practice to master, and most people lack the obsessive dedication his mission demanded. In his lucid moments between medical treatments, Kaminsky reflects on the strange mathematics that governed his life. He sacrificed his health to save 30,000 people, most of whom he never met, whose names he never learned, whose faces blurred into an endless stream of desperation. Was one life worth 30,000? The equation seems obvious until you remember that the one life was the only one he actually possessed, the only existence he could definitively control. He gave away his youth, his health, his family stability, his chance at ordinary happiness. In exchange, he ensured that thousands of families existed who would not have existed otherwise, thousands of children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren whose presence in the world traces back to a teenager, with acid-stained fingers working by candlelight in occupied Paris. Kaminsky concludes in the end that the mathematics were always false, that you cannot actually calculate the worth of sacrifice in numerical terms. You can only ask whether the person you became through your choices is someone you can live with. Looking at his ruined hands and failing body, Kaminsky decides he can live with himself. Barely, painfully, but he can live with the choices he made. Adolfo Kaminsky dies in Paris on January 9, 2016, at the age of 90. The obituaries appear in major newspapers worldwide, describing him as one of the most successful forgers in history, a man who weaponized chemistry against genocide and lived long enough to see his secret work become historical record. The funeral draws an extraordinary mixture of attendees: elderly Holocaust survivors who owe their lives to documents he forged 70 years earlier, former Algerian resistance fighters he helped during their independence war, children and grandchildren of refugees he assisted across 5 decades of continuous activism. They come from Israel and America, from Algeria and Argentina, from every corner of the diaspora his forgeries helped create. Many bring the actual documents he made, birth certificates and identity cards preserved for decades, papers so perfect that government archives still accept them as legitimate. The forgeries have outlived their creator, existing in filing cabinets and family albums, as testament to the power of individual resistance against industrial-scale oppression. What makes Kaminsky's story particularly haunting is how thoroughly it was erased from historical consciousness until his final years. The Nazis kept meticulous records of their genocidal bureaucracy, documenting every train to Auschwitz, every confiscated property, every murdered child. But resistance efforts, by their nature, left minimal documentation. Successful forgery requires invisibility. The best fake document is one that appears completely legitimate, that leaves no trace of its creation, that disappears into the bureaucratic machinery as authentic. For 50 years, Kaminsky's greatest achievements existed only as gaps in Nazi records, as families who should have been murdered but somehow survived, as children whose papers said they were Catholic, but who remembered Shabbat prayers their parents whispered in hiding. His story survived primarily through oral tradition, whispered in survivor communities, passed down as legend until he finally broke his silence. How many other Kaminskys existed whose stories never surfaced, who died without revealing their wartime activities, whose contributions to Holocaust rescue vanished with them? The technical legacy of Kaminsky's work raises uncomfortable questions about the relationship between law and morality. Every government on Earth criminalizes document forgery because authentic paperwork is essential to modern state function. Identity verification, border control, financial systems, criminal justice, all depend on the assumption that official documents can be trusted. Kaminsky proved this assumption catastrophically false, demonstrated that a sufficiently skilled individual can subvert the entire apparatus with nothing but chemistry and determination. His story celebrates this subversion because the state he undermined was Nazi Germany and its collaborators, regimes so monstrous that resisting them feels unambiguously righteous. But the techniques he pioneered remain morally neutral, applicable to any forgery regardless of purpose. The same chemistry that saved Jewish children from gas chambers could enable terrorism, human trafficking, financial fraud. Kaminsky himself wrestled with this reality, refusing commissions he deemed morally compromised, drawing lines between resistance and criminality. His ethical framework, forged to save lives, never to enable violence, provided guidance but doesn't resolve the fundamental tension between technical capability and moral application. Perhaps the most powerful aspect of Kaminsky's legacy is what it reveals about the scale of individual impact. Modern people, particularly in democratic societies with strong institutions, tend to assume that systemic problems require systemic solutions, that individual action is inherently inadequate against industrial-scale oppression. Kaminsky's life demolishes that assumption. One teenager with chemistry knowledge disrupted the Nazi genocidal apparatus, saved more lives than entire military units, accomplished through patient technical work what armed resistance could not achieve. He did this without weapons, without funding, without institutional support. Just knowledge applied with obsessive dedication. The story is simultaneously inspiring and deeply unsettling, because it suggests that most people possess more power to resist oppression than they ever exercise, that the limiting factor is not capability, but willingness to sacrifice comfort and safety. Kaminsky paid an enormous price for his resistance, his health, his family stability, his chance at ordinary happiness, and that price itself becomes part of the uncomfortable truth his story tells. Effective resistance often requires personal destruction. The final word on Kaminsky must acknowledge what he would want remembered. In his last interviews, conducted when he could barely speak above a whisper, he consistently directed attention away from himself toward the people he saved. He insisted he was not a hero, but simply someone who possessed useful skills during a time of crisis. He downplayed his suffering, pointed out that his pain was trivial compared to what Holocaust victims endured. He expressed regret about his family's sacrifices, wished he had found better balance, questioned whether his obsessive dedication was truly necessary or partially self-destructive compulsion. But he never regretted the forgeries themselves, never wished he had chosen differently when faced with the arithmetic of lives saved versus sleep lost. That mathematics, calculated in a teenager's head during Nazi occupation and never fully resolved, became the defining equation of his existence. Adolfo Kaminsky spent 70 years proving that one person with the right skills, the courage to act, and the willingness to sacrifice can rewrite reality one document at a time. The 30,000 people whose existence testifies to his work suggests he calculated correctly. The ruined body and fractured family suggest the price of that calculation exceeds what any single person should have to pay. Both truths coexist, uncomfortable and unresolvable, in the life of the teenager who erased Jewish names from Nazi documents, and in doing so erased the Nazis' power to define who deserved to exist.